She always believed that retirement would finally bring them peace. Long mornings without alarms, quiet breakfasts, slow walks through familiar streets, and a sense that after decades of compromise, they had earned calm. But instead, it was during those first ordinary weeks at home that she began to notice how different he had become. Not distant in an obvious way, but guarded, as if every casual question required careful calculation. And at first, she told herself it was nothing, that men often struggle when work no longer defines them. Yet small details started to collect in her mind like dust she couldn't ignore. The way he carried his phone everywhere, even into the garden. The way he lowered his voice when answering calls. The way he suddenly needed errands late in the evening despite having nowhere important to go. And one afternoon, while folding laundry, she found an envelope hidden beneath old paperwork, addressed not to their home but to a rented apartment across town, an address she had never seen before. And as she stood there holding it, her hands didn't shake, not yet, because her first instinct was still loyalty, still the desire to explain things away. But something inside her whispered that retirement had not revealed a new problem, it had simply removed the distractions that had kept the truth buried for years. And in that quiet house, surrounded by the life they had built together, she felt the unsettling realization that the man she shared a bed with might have been living a second life long before the silence ever began. That evening, she did not confront him. Not because she was afraid, but because experience had taught her that truth reveals itself more clearly when you listen instead of accuse. And as they sat across from each other at dinner, she studied him the way one studies a stranger on a train, noticing how easily he filled the silence with unnecessary words, how his eyes avoided hers when she mentioned the neighborhood across town, how his smile arrived a second too late. And later, when he fell asleep in front of the television, she moved quietly through the house, opening drawers she had never questioned before, touching objects that once felt shared but now felt foreign, until she found an old notebook tucked behind tax documents, its pages filled with dates, expenses, names written in a careful hand she recognized instantly. And as she read, she realized this was not evidence of a sudden mistake or a brief lapse in judgment, but a carefully maintained parallel existence stretching back years, possibly decades. And the weight of that understanding pressed into her chest, not as sharp pain, but as a slow, suffocating pressure. Because what hurt most was not the betrayal itself, but the realization that while she had been planning a peaceful ending to their story, he had been protecting a secret that reshaped its entire beginning, middle, and meaning. And as she closed the notebook, she understood that retirement had not stolen their future. It had simply stripped away the illusion that their past was ever as honest as she believed. The next morning arrived without drama. No raised voices or slammed doors, just the quiet routine they had followed for years. Coffee brewing, the sound of the newspaper unfolding, the familiar rhythm that once made her feel safe, but now felt almost surreal. And as she watched him move through the kitchen, she became painfully aware of how deeply habit can disguise truth, how easily two people can share space without sharing reality. And while he spoke casually about plans for the day, she found herself listening differently, not to his words, but to the gaps between them, the moments where honesty should have lived but never had. And it struck her then that this discovery was not about anger or revenge. It was about mourning. Mourning the version of her life she had believed in, the sacrifices she had made thinking they were mutual, the years she defended him to friends and family without ever knowing she was protecting a lie. And as she sipped her coffee, she felt something unexpected rise within her. Not panic, but clarity. A calm understanding that whatever came next would be defined by truth rather than endurance. Because for the first time in decades, she was no longer focused on holding things together. She was focused on seeing them as they truly were. And that shift, quiet and internal, marked the real beginning of change, even if he had no idea yet that the story he had carefully hidden was already unraveling in her mind. Later that afternoon, she went out alone, telling him she needed fresh air, and it was true, but not in the way he assumed, because what she needed was distance from the life she had been living on autopilot. And as she walked through familiar streets, she replayed moments from their past with a new awareness. Conversations that once felt harmless now revealing subtle evasions, sudden work trips she never questioned, emotional absences she had blamed on stress or age. And with every step, the picture became clearer, not sharper in pain, but wider in understanding, as if her mind was finally allowing itself to connect dots it had deliberately ignored for years. And she realized how often women of her generation were taught to prioritize stability over truth, to interpret discomfort as loyalty, to believe that love meant patience even when patience slowly erased the self. And sitting on a park bench, she allowed herself to acknowledge the exhaustion she had carried quietly, the constant effort to maintain harmony without ever asking whether it was real. And in that moment, she did not think about confrontation or consequences. She thought about time, about how much of it she had already given away, believing the ending would justify the compromises. And instead of anger, she felt resolve settle in, steady and unmistakable, because whatever explanation he might offer would never give her back the years she spent trusting a version of reality that only existed because she wanted it to. And as she stood to return home, she understood that the hardest part was no longer discovering the secret, but deciding how to live honestly after a lifetime of believing honesty was something you waited for rather than demanded. That evening, the house felt different. Not louder or quieter, just altered in a way only she could sense, as if the walls themselves were aware that something fundamental had shifted. And while he moved through familiar routines, setting his keys down, commenting on the weather, asking an ordinary question about dinner, she listened with a detached clarity, noticing how easily he performed normalcy, how practiced his tone was, how naturally he filled space with small talk designed to prevent deeper inquiry. And she realized that this performance had likely been happening for years, not out of cruelty, but convenience, because it is often easier to maintain alive and to dismantle a life built around it. And as they sat across from each other, she found herself studying his face, searching not for guilt but for recognition, some subtle sign that he understood the gravity of what she now carried. Yet all she saw was comfort, the ease of a man confident that the structure of his world would remain intact simply because it always had. And in that moment, she felt an unexpected sadness, not for herself, but for him, for how small his emotional vocabulary had remained, whilst hers had expanded quietly in response to survival. And as the conversation drifted without meaning, she understood that the truth no longer needed to be announced dramatically, because its power came from her awareness, not his reaction. And while she nodded at the right moments and answered when required, internally she was making decisions that did not involve asking permission, because she finally recognized that loyalty without honesty was not virtue but habit, and that choosing herself now did not require anger or shouting, only the courage to stop pretending that peace built on silence was peace at all. The next morning arrived without ceremony, the kind of ordinary dawn that once would have reassured her that life was stable and predictable, yet now felt almost surreal in its calm, because while the world outside continued as usual, cars passing, light filtering through curtains, the quiet rhythm of another day beginning, inside her something had fully separated from the version of herself who believed that endurance alone could fix what was broken. And as she stood in the kitchen holding a cup of coffee she barely tasted, she realized that clarity does not always arrive as a dramatic revelation, but often as a slow settling, a deep internal knowing that refuses to be shaken by excuses or fear. And when he spoke to her casually from the other room, asking a simple question, she noticed how her body no longer tensed in anticipation, no longer prepared itself to minimize or smooth over discomfort, because she was no longer negotiating her own reality. And that absence of tension felt unfamiliar yet profoundly grounding, as if she had finally stepped onto solid ground after years of balancing on uncertainty. And she understood that this shift did not mean she was ready to confront him or walk away immediately, but it meant that every choice from this moment forward would be made with awareness rather than hope. And that distinction mattered more than any promise he could offer, because hope had kept her waiting while awareness allowed her to move. And as she watched the morning unfold, she accepted that endings do not always begin with departures. Sometimes they begin quietly, with a woman deciding that her inner truth will no longer be postponed for the comfort of someone else. As the days stretched on, she found herself replaying moments from the past with a new lens. Conversations that once felt insignificant now revealing subtle fractures she had ignored. The pauses in his voice when certain names were mentioned, the way he redirected discussions when emotions surfaced, the excuses that had sounded reasonable only because she wanted them to be. And this re-examination was not fueled by bitterness, but by a quiet curiosity, a need to understand how deeply she had learned to doubt her own intuition. And while folding laundry or waiting at a red light, she noticed how often she had chosen peace over truth, telling herself that love meant patience, that stability required sacrifice, that questioning too much was a form of disloyalty. Yet now those beliefs felt heavy and outdated, like rules written for a life that no longer existed. And she realized that betrayal does not always shatter trust in one violent moment. Sometimes it erodes it gently over years until the person betrayed begins to disappear without anyone noticing. And this understanding stirred a subtle grief within her, not just for the relationship she thought she had, but for the parts of herself she had muted to maintain it. And as evening approached, she felt a growing resolve, not a dramatic determination to confront or escape, but a steady commitment to remain present with herself, to listen when discomfort surfaced instead of silencing it, because she finally understood that self-respect was not an act of defiance, it was an act of care, and reclaiming it would be the most honest step she could take, no matter where it eventually led. That night, as the house settled into silence and the familiar sounds of evening routines faded, she sat alone in the dim light of the living room and allowed herself to feel everything she had postponed for years. The disappointment that had been disguised as understanding, the loneliness that existed even when he was sitting right beside her, the quiet exhaustion of constantly adjusting herself to keep the balance. And for the first time, she did not rush to correct those feelings or explain them away. She let them exist without judgment, realizing how rarely she had given herself that permission. And as memories surfaced, holidays where she felt strangely invisible, conversations where her needs were subtly minimized, moments when she sensed distance but convinced herself it was temporary, she saw how loyalty had slowly turned into self-abandonment. Not because she was weak, but because she believed love required endurance more than honesty. And this realization did not break her, it steadied her, because it reframed the past not as a series of failures, but as a lesson in what happens when care for another consistently outweighs care for oneself. And as she looked around the room filled with years of shared life, she understood that acknowledging the truth did not erase those years. It simply placed them where they belonged, in the past, as part of a story that had shaped her but no longer defined her future. And in that quiet space, she made no dramatic decisions, no promises of confrontation or departure, only a simple internal vow to stop shrinking, to stop explaining away what hurt, to trust the clarity that had finally arrived, because even without knowing what tomorrow would bring, she knew one thing with certainty: she would no longer live as a secondary character in her own life. The following day unfolded with an unexpected sense of lightness, not because the situation had resolved itself, but because she was no longer carrying it alone inside her. And as she moved through her routine, she noticed how differently she occupied space, standing a little straighter, speaking with less hesitation, no longer scanning his reactions before forming her own thoughts. And this subtle shift felt almost radical after years of emotional restraint. And when they finally sat together that evening, the conversation drifted, at first through familiar territory, work, errands, small complaints. Yet beneath the surface, she felt a steady awareness guiding her, reminding her that silence was no longer protection, it was simply delay. And when she finally spoke, her voice was calm, not sharp or trembling, but clear. She did not accuse or dramatize. She described what she had seen, what she had felt, what she now understood. And as the words left her mouth, she felt no urge to soften them for his comfort, because they were not weapons, they were facts. And as he reacted, confusion, denial, fragments of explanation, she listened without absorbing, noticing how his responses circled around responsibility without ever fully touching it. And in that moment, something settled permanently within her, an understanding that closure does not require agreement, and that truth does not lose its power simply because someone refuses to accept it. And as the conversation reached its quiet end, she realized she was no longer waiting for reassurance or apology. She was witnessing, observing the difference between who he was and who she had needed him to be. And while that recognition carried sadness, it also carried relief because it freed her from the endless task of hoping he would become someone else. And as she walked away from the table, she felt the quiet strength of someone who has finally chosen honesty over illusion, knowing that whatever came next would be built on reality rather than denial, and not, after years of compromise, felt like the beginning of something real. In the days that followed, nothing dramatic changed on the surface. The house remained the same, the routines continued. The world moved forward without pause. Yet within her, everything had quietly rearranged itself, and she noticed how peace does not always arrive as happiness, but often as the absence of inner conflict, the relief of no longer arguing with one's own instincts. And as she packed away small pieces of her life, photos, letters, objects that once symbolized shared dreams, she did so without bitterness, understanding that letting go was not a rejection of the past, but a recognition of truth. And when she finally stepped outside alone one early morning, the air cool and clear, she felt something she had not felt in years: ownership of her own direction, not certainty, not excitement, but permission. Permission to choose herself without apology. And she realized that betrayal had not been the end of her story. It had been the moment the narrative shifted, forcing her to see that love without respect slowly erodes the self, and that healing begins when honesty replaces endurance. And as she walked forward into a future still undefined, she did not feel broken or triumphant, only grounded, aware that strength does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it arrives as quiet resolve, as the decision to live aligned with one's truth. And in that alignment, she found something deeper than closure. She found freedom, the kind that does not depend on another person's actions, but on one's own willingness to finally stand fully present in their own life.